My name is Rich Carson. I wrote the Book of Change, which is about a process I developed in terms of organizational change management, which is based on my 45 years of experience, as 30 of it was as a manager and another 15 as a consultant and academic, where I did my doctorate studies in organizational behavior.
And today we're going to talk about public to private leadership lessons.
Yes.
Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. My name is Mark Banicevich, and as you just heard again, I have the pleasure of spending time with Dr. Richard Carson. Rich, thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you.
The topic, public to private leadership lessons, and we've got the subtitle, Learning from Advising 3 State Governors and How Those Lessons Apply in Today's Corporate Landscape.
Yes.
Nice meaty topic. I'm going to start with the question, what is the single biggest culture shock for a public sector leader who transitions to a corporate board, and how can the board help them to navigate that culture shock?
Well, I think the first thing is to understand that you're dealing with 2 sets of cycles. You're moving from an environment where you deal with election cycles to economic cycles. The other thing is that you're shifting from kind of votes to dollars and politics to profit. And so those are really the major distinctions that a manager in transition needs to understand.
They do sound quite scary. How can the existing board help a new director to navigate that change?
Well, I think they need to basically spend some time. You need to hire somebody that, first of all, you believe can make the change. And in the interview process, really dig deep into that and ask them how they're going to do that. I remember one job, the guy asked me, he said, well, how are you going to manage 165 people? I said, I'm not. So I'm going to manage 7 people, and they're going to manage 165 people. So you really need, as a board, to, and you may need to hire somebody as kind of a consultant, and there's people who do that, to help you with the hiring process, to make sure that you hire somebody who has the skill set to make that transition, but also provide them with the adequate resources to make the transition.
You've alluded to the fact that in the public sector, your accountability is either to the public or a legislature or a governor or government. How does the leader's mindset shift when they're suddenly accountable to shareholders in a board?
Yeah, I thought about that. It isn't really that different. Certainly the goal and maybe even the performance metrics will be different, but you're still dealing with some group of people, whether it's the public or consumers. You still deal with vendors. So it's that kind of, in terms of who you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, isn't really all that different. I think just in terms of what the goals and the metrics are very different.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And another can be a key difference between corporate and public is the pace of change. The pace of change in government tends to be eye-wateringly slow. How can a public sector leader who may be used to a long legislative cycle, as you've said, 4 years for you, it's 3 years for us in New Zealand, how can they adapt to the speed and agility required for corporate governance?
My personal experience is you don't really need to do that. And the reason is that although you may have in the public sector, you're right, you have a legislative process, all kinds of people involved in it, takes forever. But as a manager, for me, it was day to day. And there are things that happen in the public sector. I'll give you an example. Unforeseen events. I went through a flood where the city I was managing went underwater. I had a case where I actually had one of the groups I had was animal control, and a dog killed an 8-year-old boy. So day to day, you still have to deal with issues that come out of nowhere. So it isn't like you're not only, I mean, certainly part of your job is managing the legislative process for the elected officials. But the day-to-day issues is whatever walks in the door that minute. And that doesn't change whether you're in the public sector or private sector. As a manager, it's always something.
Yes.
Your job is, one of the things I learned is that people really rely on you to make the hard decisions. When something bad happens, they come to you and they go, what are we going to do? And it's your decision for good, for better or worse, to make that decision and deal with it. So it's the same in both the private and the public sector in terms of the kind of things that a manager has to be able to be a person who thinks on their feet.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. You've advised governors. What's a lesson from managing a public crisis? You just gave a couple of examples, a natural disaster or a budget shortfall, that is directly applicable to a corporate boardroom facing a major reputational or financial crisis.
It's you really need to kind of manage the message. In other words, once you determine what the issue is, how you're going to deal with the issue, you really need to communicate that issue both to staff, to the public, to any number of people. So you need to really craft a message that answers people's questions now, and it has to be a message that is consistently delivered by the board, by the manager, by whoever is empowered, your communications person, anybody who is empowered to answer those kind of questions. So really kind of, I don't want to sound negative in terms of managing the message, but people do want to know what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it. And you need to be able to think through that and provide that information.
Mm. Yeah,
the board has to be on board. I mean, they have to say, yeah, okay, this is what we're going to do, and these are going to be the people that explain the situation.
All right, yeah, I like that. That's a great pickup. Thank you. How can a corporate board and a CEO apply the art of coalition building? If you're working in government, that's one of the key things that you have to be able to do, right? You have to be able to work with others, particularly from across different political parties. It's an essential skill for a governor. So how can a corporate board and a CEO apply that art of coalition building to get buy-in from diverse stakeholders like investors, employees, regulators?
Well, I think it's a very similar process. One is to you can use you can use surveys. Okay, in other words, to kind of get some idea of what people are thinking, feeling, what they want. You can use focus groups of individuals around a particular topic. You can bring in essentially opposition leaders and sit them down and say, look, is there any common ground here? And it doesn't really matter if they are in the private sector or the public sector. You can still bring people together and sit down and talk about issues and try to find solutions. I don't like it's you do. I think you do a lot more of that just because you have to in the public sector than you do in the private sector.
So it is certainly a skill set from the public sector that can add value in the private sector. And as you say, you start by collecting broad information through things like focus groups and surveys, and then get the people around the table and have solid discussions.
If you're in the private sector, I mean, you're dealing with, management and labor. And there's a whole process you can go through and hire people to help you to, kind of resolve the issues. But, that kind of thing happens all the time in the public sector, because there's always somebody who wants to do this and somebody who doesn't want you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the citizen activist group versus the developers. So in any job where you're a manager in an organization, you're going to have opposing viewpoints internally and externally that you need. Part of your skill set needs to be to help resolve those issues. The board, whether it's elected or appointed, the board feels that you aren't able to resolve those issues and there's a problem. They hired you. They don't want to do it. They basically want to be the good guys. They hired you to resolve these issues. So you need that skill set regardless.
Great. Yeah, thank you. What is the most critical public sector leadership lesson that corporate boards often overlook? And what's the cost of missing that?
The
most critical public sector leadership lesson that corporate boards miss?
Well, I think that it starts with who they hire. I've experienced this personally. Sometimes you hire somebody because you like them or because they're your nephew. I've gone through this a couple of times. And, you need to hire somebody based on their abilities, not who they know, but what they can do and what their skill set is. And a lot of times they hire people for all the wrong reasons and then wonder why things go south on them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the most important thing you do is really, even if you have to, hire a headhunter, you need to really have an adequate process to vet somebody to make sure that they are psychologically a good fit for your organization, not just their skill set. It's not whether you just like them or don't like them, but you really need to have a very comprehensive process to bring somebody on board. And that also applies all the way through the organization, but specifically to the board when you're going to hire a manager.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. If you've got a board member, a person moving from a public sector leadership role that may be, used to a command and control environment, and then moving to a private sector role where they have to rely on influence and collaboration, what's the board's role in helping that public to private sector leader succeed?
Well, first of all, when it comes to command and control, it depends on your job. In the public sector, if you're the police chief, it's very much a command and control job, mm-hmm. as opposed to an urban planner whose job is citizen involvement and everybody should feel good. The biggest problem I had in my organization was I had a group of planners and a group of engineers. And believe me, they do not understand each other. They're like from different planets. I had to be the translator between the two groups. This is what they're trying to tell you. So anyway, try to give me the question again.
Yeah, sure. Just if you've got a leader moving from the public sector to the private sector, and they have to transition to this influence and collaboration model, what's the role of the board in helping that new leader or new director succeed in the new environment?
Well, it's like I said, it's up to the board to really understand who they need to hire in terms of what is their skill set, what is their temperament, what is their kind of not only professional profile, but psychological profile, in terms of you just don't hire somebody because somebody told you they were really great. It depends on, of course, it depends on the size of the organization, but there's lots of ways that you can do kind of skill assessments for a management position like that. I think it's really important that they get that right the first time. There's nothing worse than hiring an executive who just pisses everybody off, both on staff in terms of the public or vendors or consumers who really isn't a good fit for the job.
So the most important thing for the board is to make sure that they follow a strong process to find the right person for the role, and
Right.
then induct them well and give them the right sort of training and stuff going forward. But the most important thing is to hire the right person in the first place.
Well, I mean, there's two parts. One is what is the industry they're in, and how well does that person understand their kind of venue, but also their management strengths and weaknesses, aside from the industry needs and their understanding of the industry. Just as a manager, to manage people, budgets, expectations. How good are they at that?
Yes, yes. Public sector leaders are often highly skilled at navigating the political environments, regulatory environments. How can a corporate board leverage that unique skill set to set better management to better manage their external risks?
Well, I think whether you're a manager, an executive director type in the public sector or the private sector, you really have a different set of customers, but you really have to have the ability to maybe more in the public sector, but really kind of get people to understand your point of view and understand their point of view, and bring people together, or kind of coerce people to do things one way or another. So in that way, it's very, very similar.
Right, right. So in terms of using that skill set to manage their broader risks in the environment, what can the corporate board do to say, hey, we've got somebody here who's used to navigating this landscape around people. How can that be used to better manage corporate risk?
That's interesting. It's most corporations have somebody on board who's called the risk manager. And the risk manager's job is to kind of troubleshoot and be very kind of preventative in terms of, well, don't do that because this will happen, or there's laws about this, etc. But what they rarely have is a change manager, who is somebody who is proactive. Like I said, it's a fairly new field, but a change manager is really somebody who can look out at the greater environment, who kind of over the horizon, and help the organization and the board identify issues that need change, or that they, whether they may pick up something that's going on within the organization, the board is clueless is going on, that needs changing. People are saying, look, there's this change in technology called AI, and what's that? What does that mean? And it's, are we gonna lay people off, or so risk management and change management are totally reactive versus proactive, and you really need a person, a position, and that's their sole job. If you can, if you're a large enough organization, a lot of times that person ends up being either the risk manager or the human resource director, who takes on that role, but it's not necessarily trained in the change management process.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Thank you. Given the increasing scrutiny on corporate social responsibility, we've got this major trend happening globally around social responsibility for corporates. How can a board use lessons from a governor's focus on public interest to ensure that the company's purpose goes beyond just maximizing profit?
I think that social responsibility is something that is often overlooked by the private sector. A good example is Bud Light. Okay,
Yeah, tell me about that example.
Bud Light, basically, the Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, hired as a transgender spokesperson to sell their beer to Bubba down at the tavern. And it just blew up in their face because they were, the people who drank Bud Light were so offended that Bud Light it was the best-selling beer in America, and it lost that number one position out to Modelo because people quit drinking it.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's very, it is incumbent on the private sector to understand what they're doing in terms of social responsibility. They may be thinking that they're doing something that's very trendy, maybe something that they personally feel needs to be done, but they also need to understand who their customers are.
Yes.
Being socially responsible for the wrong people is a deadly recipe. And I think the other example was Target, who started selling clothing for transgender children, which was bizarre. But they had suffered the same problem in terms of not understanding the mood of folks who were their customers. So social responsibility is really relative to your customer base. If you are going to impose social responsibility on a group of people who don't agree with you, that could backfire.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. I've got one final question for you. What advice would you give to a director who has public sector experience and is moving on to a private sector board?
Well, I think basically to understand that you're moving from kind of the public sector in terms of the legislative process, that kind of thing. You're have a totally different metric in terms of profit and what people want in terms of profit. And having spent most of my life, as a consultant, I've been in the private sector, but most of my life as a public sector manager, I've not looked at profit. Profitability was not high on my list. Budgeting, absolutely.
Mm.
Being cost effective with the public's resources is imperative, but it's not profit. There is no such thing as profit in the public sector. So that would be a very difficult metric to keep top of mind.
Right. Richard, we've covered a lot in this conversation, everything from the significant differences between public sector and private sector, for example, moving from economic cycles to, moving from political cycles to economic cycles, and the focus on profit in the corporate board. We've talked about understanding your customer base and making sure that the decisions that you make are aligned with your customers' values.
Right.
There's been some really, really interesting insights in that, Richard. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
I'll hopefully speak to you again soon, and
Yeah.
I'll see you next episode.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching this episode of Governance Bites. We have more episodes on YouTube and your favorite podcast channel, where I interview directors and experts on various topics relating to boards of directors and governance. We'd love to see you back, and please like, subscribe, and share the videos and podcasts.